Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah chapter 4, Halacha 2, and this Halacha is going to touch on something that we were working on in Halacha 1, which is what happens if one person is saying, "Oh, it's not like that. Don't distribute it like that. Distribute it like this." So that's going to open up the case of, oh well, what happens if somebody's cheating? What's happening if somebody's resorting to improper tactics in order to get Peah? And the rest of the sugya is going to go into the question of, well, how do you acquire something? What is an acquisition? And this matters because we care about stealing. Don't forget, this is property that has entitlement to poor people. And what happens when the poor people themselves start to come and cheat? What do we do? So the rabbis went and imposed very stiff restrictions on this because they want to stop fights. They want to stop fights between poor people who are trying to gather it. But you can imagine where people would play games. Maybe they're not learned, and maybe they didn't study, and they don't know, and their derech eretz is no good, and they come and they start just taking everything, and it's really obscene. And you're going to see in the beginning of the sugya, they're going to do a lot of obscene things to take the stuff, and what happens. But most importantly, this is going to get into a question of what is an acquisition and how do you acquire it. So the Mishnah starts off, and again, this Mishnah is discussing the laws applicable to the poor person who's going to get into these improper tactics and, or effects for an invalid act of acquisition in his quest to take the Peah. The Mishnah says, if one of the poor took some Peah that he collected and threw it over the remaining standing Peah, he has no rights to it all. In other words, he took the Peah that he acquired, and he went to another part of the field, and he took his Peah and put it on top of the other Peah. So it looks like the other Peah hasn't been acquired, or has been acquired by this guy, this Peah that wasn't acquired, and he's using it to basically acquire all the Peah for himself. In other words, instead of going home and taking your Peah home, he's going and taking his Peah and putting it on top of another area's Peah and trying to acquire that as well. And the Mishnah says that he has no right to it all. In other words, he does not acquire the standing Peah because his action is legally meaningless, and he acquires nothing with it. And this is with respect to whether he may retrieve the Peah that he threw. So the question is okay, you have two issues of Peah. You have the Peah that has the standing grain that had Peah thrown on top of it. And what's going to happen to the Peah that he threw? Perhaps the Peah he threw is also going to be null and void. We're going to find out about that later. So the Mishnah continues, says, if he fell upon the standing Peah and he spread his cloak over it, they may remove it from him. So what's happening here? This is a case where other poor people may remove him or his cloak from the Peah and take it for themselves. And this is because the act of falling on the Peah and spreading a cloak on it does not constitute a legal kinyan. In other words, taking your cloak and spreading it over the Peah to hide it so nobody else can get it, the Mishnah is saying this is not a valid form of kinyan. So you have to be able to detach it and lift the Peah in order to acquire it. So just spreading your cloak over it to hide it or putting bundles of other grain on top of it is not an acquisition. So they may remove it from him. In other words, other poor people may come and take it for themselves, and they are actually the ones who acquire it because they're separating it and detaching it in a proper way. So I want to point out that if we look in Shos and Mishpat, Safe 237, there's going to be a set of rules that is very important. It's a general rule that if somebody is engaged in inquiring something, and that's what the guy with the cloak is doing effectively, and he's close to legalizing the acquisition. In other words, he didn't quite acquire it yet, but he's in the process of it. The Chosen Mishpat is saying in 237, it is forbidden for someone else to preempt him and to acquire it by himself. And the Mishnah is implying that in this case, the poor people may remove him from the Peah even initially, and the law against preemption has no bearing here because all the poor people have an equal right to Peah, and therefore are regarded as equally engaged in seeking the acquisition. So one does not acquire greater rights by coming and throwing the cloak over it. And there's another way to look at it where the reason that we rule against preemption applies to transactions that are freely available. But when a person is ready and poised to complete a transaction, others are expected to go and do a different business opportunity. But in this case, he's coming where he's about to acquire an ownerless object like Peah. So in this case, there's no restriction against preemption because these opportunities are not readily available anywhere else. And this is kind of the point of going out there, right? So coming and taking your cloak, that's not a form of acquisition, so you're not really preempting it. In other words, you didn't preemptively acquire it, and so since everybody else is out in the field getting something that's ownerless, and they don't have an opportunity to get something else, since it's not an acquisition, the other people can come and acquire it. And the Mishnah continues. It says the same applies with regards to leket, and the same applies with regards to the forgotten sheaf. In other words, leket, those are the gleanings where one or two stalks fall from within the sickle of harvesting, and the farmer has to leave that to the poor. So these two have to be left for the poor, and the Mishnah is trying to teach that the laws that apply to a person who attempts to acquire Peah improperly by throwing some of his own Peah on it, or falling on it or covering it, apply also to a person who tries to acquire a leket and shchicha in these ways. And so it's really trying to be all encompassing. The Mishnah is going to rule that a poor person has no rights in the standing Peah upon which he threw the Peah that he collected. It did not, however, issue an explicit ruling regarding the status of Peah that he threw. And the Gemara cites a Baraisa that addresses the point. So the Sugya reads like this. It says, it was taught in a Baraisa in the name of Rabbi Meir, we apply a penalty to it and exact from him both the attached Peah that he threw and the attached Peah that he attempted to acquire. Now, I want to point out something from the Burim of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And if you take a look at Safe 79 there and Safe 80 there, he's saying that there's really a double penalty that's being applied by the rabbis here. And he's saying that somebody who tries to secure Peah legally has a double penalty. First is he loses any cut Peah that he employed in his unfair attempt to secure the attached Peah. And secondly, he loses the right to compete with the other poor over the attached Peah that he attempted to secure. Now, keep in mind that the Rambam here has an explanation here that's a little bit vague from the Hilchos Matanos Aniyim, chapter 2, Halacha 18. The Rambam says that there's a penalty even in the later case. So some understand the Rambam to mean that one who fell or threw his cloak over the standing Peah is penalized in that any Peah he collected beforehand is confiscated and left for open competition. And others explain this Rambam as the person does not lose any Peah that he may have acquired beforehand, since it was not used improperly. In other words, if he had the Peah, he cut it, detached it, but then he acted improperly and put it over other Peah in another field, that the first one was not done improperly. It was the second one that's done improperly. So, since, according to some people who explain this Rambam, this cryptic Rambam, as he does not lose any Peah he may have acquired beforehand, since it was not taken improperly, he is penalized. However, he only loses his right to compete with other poor people for the standing Peah he tried to acquire improperly. So, in trying to dig into this and trying to understand, this sugya, let me read it again. It was taught in Bryce in the name of Rabbi Meir. We apply a penalty to it and exact from him both the detached Peah that he threw and the attached Peah that he attempted to acquire. The question is what's going to happen with the first Peah and what's going to happen with the second Peah. So not only does the thrower fail to acquire the standing Peah with his action, according to what Rabbi Meir is saying, but he's also penalized with the loss of rights to the Peah that he collected legitimately and then threw. And the Rosh Cirillo points out, he says that this penalty was imposed on him because he sought to gain an unfair advantage by covering the Peah and standing Peah, by covering the standing Peah with his acquired Peah. And since such aggressive behavior, if tolerated, says the Rosh Cirillo, it can lead to fights between poor people, and the rabbis took stiff measures to discourage it by imposing the penalty. The Rashba points out in Baba Metzia, page 10a in the Bavli, that the rabbis do have the authority to deprive somebody of something that has been legally acquired through the power of the Bet Din to declare anyone's belongings ownerless. So effectively, that would be the mechanism by which Rabbi Meir is referring to that would allow this first properly acquired Peah to be declared ownerless. So you have to understand what is it that because you have the first case where the person's detaching the Peah legitimately. How can it be that they're saying it's not legitimate, even though what he did the second act was a joke, was a game? So this is a very deep point and a deep principle in Judaism from what we see in Baba Metzia, page 10a in the Bavli, that the rabbis do have the authority to deprive somebody of something that was legally acquired through the power of the Bet Din to declare it ownerless. And that is effectively the mechanism that's happening here. And the rabbis impose that because they want to stop fights between the poor people where people are going to come and just play games to acquire all the Peah. So the Gemara is going to inquire, is going to say, so far we learned only that we penalize one who throws his produce on the attached Peah intentionally. But what happens if somebody does so unintentionally? In other words, says the Rosh Cirillo, says that is, if one inadvertently dropped his acquired Peah on standing Peah, do we penalize him as well? That's effectively what this is going to be asking. And the Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say, the Sugya says, we penalize him even if he did so inadvertently. And furthermore, we penalize him even if he threw bundles of collected Peah over the standing Peah. So why would that be? The Rosh Cirillo says that it's to stop somebody to do it intentionally, and pretend like it was an accident. So they're really cutting it off. They're saying, we're just not tolerating this behavior at all. Even if you did it this way, where it was inadvertent, you're going to open it up where people are going to play games with it, and they're going to all pretend. Everybody's going to pretend, because that's the incentive, that hey, I did it by accident, and so you just have the same mess. So the Gemara is going to cite an Amoraic ruling, which is going to be challenged by the Mishnah, which will be challenged from our Mishnah. It says, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said in the name of Abba Cohen of Bardalea, that a person acquires a found object that is within 4 amos. So we know that there's a stiff penalty when you're acquiring it in a way like a jokester, and you're cheating or you're effectively stealing, because you didn't really acquire it, you're just reserving it, and it's not an acquisition. You're trying to cheat other poor people out of their produce. It's something that belongs to poor people in general, and you're playing games with it. You're trying to cheat. And so the sages came along, and the tradition is that this person who's cheating at the end of the day gets nothing. So, okay, this is the idea of Das Torah, is that the cheater at the end of the day is not ever going to get benefit from his theft. And there's a rule in Judaism that we always have it in a way where if somebody's having theft, you're never allowed to have benefit from the theft. It's always that way. So the question's going to come along about, well, what's going to be a valid acquisition? How do you acquire something? What is an acquisition? We know that somebody who's playing games with it gets punished. Fine. He loses his first part. He loses the second part. That's fine. But what counts as an acquisition then? How do you do it? So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is pointing out that a person acquires a found object that is within his 4 amos. Now, the rest of the sugya and the rest of the halacha is going to get into this whole thing about 4 amos and what is that. In other words, a person comes along within 4 amos of an ownerless article, and he acquires it, and no one else may take it. And that's what the Rashi says in Baba Metzia, page 10a. So that's what we're talking about. The Gemara wants to know, what is the source for this method of acquisition? In other words, you come within 4 amos of it, it's ownerless, and what's going to happen in order to acquire it? So what is the scriptural source for this method of acquisition? Says the sugya, the verse following stated by David to his son Solomon. So if you look at Chronicles 1, chapter 22, line 14, King David is relating to his son, the future King Solomon, that he had intended to build the Holy Temple himself, but he was precluded from doing so because Hashem declared through the prophet Natan, that not he, but Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, would build it. And in this verse, he relates that while Hashem denied him permission to build the temple, he nevertheless designated a fortune of gold, silver, and other raw materials for the eventual construction. So the sugya reads from Chronicles like this. It says, King David's talking, "Behold, in my poverty, I have prepared for the house of Hashem 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and copper and iron beyond weighing, because there was so much. And I have prepared wood and stones, but you should add to these." Now, that's going to be a question about how do you get so much money? He's claiming poverty. So if David had the resources to dedicate such a fortune in the temple, how could he say this quote, "in my poverty"? So evidently, David never took physical possession of his wealth. Rather, in the course of waging war, he came across the spoils, and he consecrated them as soon as they were within his 4 amos. So obviously then, one acquires ownerless property that is within his 4 amos. The Rosh Cirillo here says that the Gemara statement begs the question, what difference does it make whether David had physical possession of these spoils or he acquired them through the 4 Amos method, since in any event they were legally his when he consecrated them. He was actually wealthy, but he should not have stayed in my poverty. And the simple answer, says the Rosh Cirillo, is that since the property did not come from his coffers, which were actually empty, but was found property that he confiscated in his war when he came across it, despite having limited means of his own, he could justifiably say that he consecrated it in poverty. So the question here is going to be, a question of this 4 Amos method of Kinyan. The Baba Metzia, page 10a, in the Bavli states that the 4 Amos method of Kinyan is rabbinic in nature and was instituted in order to prevent quarrels that would arise from people competing over ownerless objects. But the Mara Fulda understands the Yerushalmi is holding that the Kinyan affected through the 4 Amos method is actually biblical in nature, and he actually provides source from the view from the fact that the Yerushalmi cites a scriptural verse as a source of the Kinyan where the Bavli doesn't. So, according to the Mara Fulda, Mara Fulda is pointing out that the Yerushalmi is effectively saying this is a d'oraita way of acquisition, but the Bavli leaves it as d'Rabbanan. I would like to point out that this is really an asmata, that this is not from the 5 books of Moses. This is from the writings. So we don't really take halacha from the writings, but it could be a clue that this could be a tradition that even goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu, and that they were following it over here in the time of the writings, and it just shows that it's an ancient thing and it wasn't instituted recently, that this might actually be something that has always been in Judaism and not a new thing, so that really they can all be right. And really what's happening is that you might just have this very, very old way of acquiring that really just goes back all the way to the beginning, and that even though it's not written in the Torah, we see evidence of this in the writings. So yeah, okay, maybe it is d'Rabbanan, but it might just be something that's just an ancient part of our tradition. So the Gemara is going to analyze this, and Rabbi Yonah says, Rav Hoshaya questioned this teaching as follows. It says, what are we dealing with here in the verse? If you suggested this wealth was within David's 4 Amos before he consecrated it, such that he acquired it legally, and David was indeed a rich man and should not have referred to himself as being in a state of poverty. And so he continues, says, if this wealth was outside his 4 Amos, such that he did not acquire legal title to it, how could he have consecrated it? So the Sugya says, why can a person consecrate that which is not his? So we know that a man has to consecrate property that's only his property. So if he's outside of the 4 Amos, well, it's not really a kinyan, so how could he acquire it? And if it's within it, then why are you saying he acquired it? Why are you saying he was poor? So the Sugya continues and says, and we preserve the above teaching by explaining the verse to mean that David consecrated his fortune bit by bit. So the Sugya is basically saying the first that he found he consecrated, and then at any one time he never really had a lot at any one time because he was always just in a process of continuously consecrating as he got stuff. So in other words, he was actually acquiring it bit by bit, and he never really owned enough at any one time to be considered wealthy. And so then you could say, well, the verse means that he acquired this treasure and booty by virtue of being within the 4 Amos, and so that does serve as a source of the rule that one acquires ownerless property that is within his 4 Amos, but that really what's happening is as he's getting it, he's doing it, and so he never really amassed wealth and then did it. He was always in this thing of always consecrating. He was always in this process of continuously consecrating. And wow, we have to also look at that, because there's a poisonous attitude in our society today about people who have this mentality from the Yetzer Hara that, hey, I don't want to give charity until I make all this money first, and then after I give the money, then I'll give charity. And it's not the right way. And we see that from King David, that as you're getting money, you have to be consecrating it and you have to be tithing it. Bit by bit, you have to do it. That's the right way to do it. So the Gemara is going to present an alternate interpretation of this verse, talking about King David, and according to which it does not support the law that one acquires ownerless property within 4 amos. So there's a different interpretation. And Rabbi Avin says, actually, we can say that David took physical possession of his entire fortune prior to consecrating it. For what is the lesson that David conveyed in the statement in my poverty? He taught that regardless of how much a person amasses, there is no wealth in the presence of the one who spoke and the world came into being. So what a deep idea. I want to look at one of the commentators on this. Mara Fulda is going to explain like this. He's going to say, while David was certainly wealthy by human standards, for he had the means to consecrate the fortune for the temple, he referred to himself as being in a state of poverty because relative to the Creator, whom he was dedicating his wealth, he was considered poor. And as the scripture says in Haggai chapter 2, verse 8, it says, mine is the silver and mine is the gold, so says Hashem, Lord of hosts. Thus, says Amara Fulda, the fact that he declared that he had dedicated his wealth in poverty does not prove that he acquired the wealth by means of 4 amos. So, what a deep mystical idea. So, alternatively, says the Sugya, the word be'ani does not mean in my poverty, as you assumed, for David was actually enormously wealthy. Rather, it means through my affliction. So, David meant to tell Solomon that in order to reserve as much money as possible for the temple, he would fast and consecrate to heaven, to the temple, the money that he would otherwise have spent on his royal feast. So Mara Fulda explains this like this. He says, this does not mean that David continuously fasted, obviously, but rather that he would eat simple meals in the place of giant royal banquets that befit a king. So the verse does not refer to actual poverty. It just means that he was doing it where he was depriving himself and eating something very modest and simple and humble, and then using what he would have saved to dedicate. But the verse does not refer to actual poverty. It's actually providing no support for the concept of 4 amos as a valid mean of Kinyan, according to this reading. So that's a deep idea that we all have to learn from, that even though King David had the means to have big feasts, that there's a virtue and a value to eating simple food and saving the money. So the Gemara is going to challenge Rish Lakish's ruling that one acquires ownerless property by virtue of being within 4 amos. Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi raised the following challenge before Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and it says, can one actually acquire ownerless property by means of 4 amos? But we learned in the Mishnah over in Baba Metzia, chapter 1, Halacha 4, and in the Bavli that would be 10a, in Baba Metzia 10a, it says, if one saw a lost article and fell upon it, and another person came and seized it, the one who seized it had acquired it. In other words, what that Mishnah is saying is that falling on an article is not a valid act of Kinyan. and therefore the first person has not gained possession of the article. Rather, the second person is the first person to perform a valid kinyan, and he becomes the owner. In other words, merely seizing an article without lifting it is not a valid act of kinyan. So it's the second person who seized it and lifted it, and that's what the valid act of kinyan is. So if one can acquire any ownerless article by means of 4 amos, then let the first person acquire the lost object by virtue of being first to have had it within the 4 amos. That's really what the question is going to be here. So the question is going to be like, well, do you have to acquire it, or you just have to move within 4 amos? And Rish Lakish is going to deflect this challenge. He says to Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, he says, interpret the Mishnah as referring to a case where the one who fell on the lost article did not say, let my 4 amos acquire the lost article for me. My ruling that one acquire ownerless property that is within 4 amos, however, refers to a case where somebody does make that declaration. So what Rish Lakish is saying is that no, you do acquire within 4 amos, and it's yours. It's a kinyan, except that you have to actually make an intent that you've acquired it and make a declaration, so that even without lifting it, that even the statement that you intended to acquire it, there has to be some intention there, that's what's going to be where it's acquired. So merely coming along and saying that, I acquired it even though I was in 4 amos, but I didn't say anything, that's not an acquisition. And so Rish Lakish's point is that he only acquired it because he did make that statement. So Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi is going to challenge Rish Lakish from this Mishnah about this way of acquiring. It says, but we learned in the Mishnah, if one of the poor people fell upon Peah, or he spread his cloak over it, they may remove it from him. Now, if one can acquire ownerless articles by means of 4 amos, then let the first poor person acquire the Peah by virtue of being the first to have had it within his 4 amos. So, in other words, this challenge is basically saying, says the Rosh Cirillo, that the person who fell upon the Peah obviously came within 4 amos of it, yet the Mishnah rules that others can remove it from him. Evidently, one does not acquire ownerless property that is within 4 amos. And according to some of the commentators, in a case where the poor person falls upon Peah, he's penalized with the loss of the Peah that he sought to acquire improperly. So why would it be that the Mishnah is being sort of contrary to Rish Lakish's opinion? And even if it were true that one acquires an ownerless object that is within 4 amos, here the rabbis penalized him by confiscating the property, the Peah, that he fell upon. And the Maram Shif is going to answer that. And he's going to say that a penalty was imposed on him because of an unfair advantage that he gained by falling upon the Peah. If, however, he acquires a Peah by being in his 4 amos, as he should, if Rish Lakish is correct, then a penalty would not be in order, since he acquired the Peah fairly with a valid kinyan. So the Mishnah's ruling that the other poor people may remove him from the Peah presents a difficulty to Rish Lakish's ruling. So what's going on here? And Rish Lakish is going to deflect this challenge as well. He's going to say to Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, that Mishnah too refers to a case where the one who fell upon the Peah did not say, let my 4 amos acquire the Peah for me. In other words, there still has to be an acquisition. Just coming and throwing the Peah on top of it isn't an acquisition. Coming within 4 amos isn't an acquisition. He has to have a valid act of kinyan, and being within 4 amos, says Rish Lakish, and making that statement, that's what does it. Not just coming within it, which is what the challenge that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi is challenging. In other words, saying that just coming along and being the first one there and coming within 4 amos as being an acquisition. Rish Lakish is saying no, you actually have to say something in order to acquire it. And Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi is going to challenge this again by Rish Lakish, and here's the challenge. But Rabbi Chia taught in a Baraisa, if two poor people were fighting over a sheaf of shchicha, and another poor person came and snatched it from before them, he has acquired it. Now, here's the insight on that. If somebody can come along and acquire any ownerless property by means of 4 amos, then let the first person who have come within 4 amos of the shchicha acquire it. So why does the snatcher, who certainly came after, acquire it? So Rish Lakish is going to deflect that challenge as well. And he said to Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi that Baraisa too refers to a case where the first person to come within the 4 amos did not say, let my 4 amos acquire the shchicha for me. In other words, there has to be this sort of acquisition kinyan. Pnei Moshe is going to address the fact that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi seemingly asks the same question again and again, but from different sources 3 times, only to get the same answer from Rish Lakish 3 times. And having heard Rish Lakish respond to the first challenge, says the Pnei Moshe, why did he present another? And Pnei Moshe offers amazing insight based on his own opinion of the Yerushalmi's understanding of Rish Lakish. As explained, Pnei Moshe maintains that the Yerushalmi agrees with the Bavli and holds that the 4 amos method of Kinyan is effective even without an explicit declaration of intent to acquire, but it is ineffective if the person actually demonstrates a contrary intent. In other words, he makes it clear that he wishes to utilize a different Kinyan and not the 4 amos. And accordingly, says the Pnei Moshe, this explains that in each case there is a greater novelty to Rish Lakish's answer. That the first challenge deals with an ordinary lost object, and Rish Lakish explains that the 4 amos method of acquisition is ineffective because by falling on the object, the person demonstrated his intent not to acquire it by means of 4 amos. That's really an amazing insight. And the Pnei Moshe continues this unbelievably smart insight. He says, Rabbi Yaakov responds with a challenge from the case of Peah, for he assumes that Rish Lakish's explanation does not fit there. And since the poor person has rights in Peah along with all the poor people, even before he performs a kinyan, he ought to be able to acquire it by means of 4 amos, despite his intent to utilize a different kinyan. Rish Lakish replies that even in the case of Peah, the 4 amos method of acquisition is ineffective when the person does not intend to utilize it. And Rabbi Yaakov then asks, in this third case, about the case of shchicha, for his challenge has a new dimension. In each of the previous cases, the person fell upon the item that he sought to gain, thus demonstrating that he did not intend to acquire it by means of the 4 amos method. Here, however, where nobody fell upon the sheaf of shchicha, there is no reason to assume that the parties do not intend to acquire it within the 4 amos method. Why then does the first person to arrive there not gain ownership? And Rish Lakish responds that even here there's evidence he does not intend to acquire the sheaf with the 4 amos method, for if he had the intent there would be no point in fighting over the sheaf. Whoever was there first would have assumed ownership. But by fighting over it, he demonstrates that he is uninterested in using the 4 amos method of Kinyan, and it is therefore ineffective. And that is just such a deep series of insights by Rish Lakish. And basically he's saying that in each of these 3 challenges, that the person did not intend to acquire it by the 4 Amos method. So it's not acquired. And that's really just beautiful and deep and unbelievably intelligent and smart. And it shows us about intent and valid forms of acquisition, and that if you're going to be trying to acquire it and you ignore the 4 Amos method, you didn't acquire it. So even if you came along and came within 4 Amos but didn't have the intention to acquire it with that method, you never acquired it. And that's why you need that statement, according to Rish Lakish, is that that statement is coming along and saying that you intended to acquire it with the 4 Amos method. And in Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi's challenges, he basically was missing the point that they were trying to acquire it with another method of Kinyan and not with this method. And that's the point that the Pnei Moshe points out about this, that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi was missing, and really the brilliance of Rish Lakish's point. So the sugyas are going to continue, and Rabbi Rish Lakish has defended his position that 4 Amos is a valid method of acquiring an ownerless property, and there's an opposing opinion, and that opinion is going to come to light in connection with the Mishnah in Gitten, chapter 8, Halacha 2, which teaches that if a man threw a get to his wife while she was standing in the public domain, and it landed on the ground close to her within 4 Amos, she is divorced, as though that it landed in her domain. And there's going to be a statement that's going to talk about this Mishnah. So Rabbi Yassa says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, this teaching vis-a-vis the area within the 4 Amos of a person is considered like a person's private domain was taught in regard to a divorce, but not so with regards to the acquisition of a gift. In other words, although somebody can convey a gift by placing it in the recipient's private domain, one cannot convey a gift by placing it within 4 Amos of the intended recipient in the public domain. We see here that Rabbi Yochanan disputes Rish Lakish's assertion that one can acquire an ownerless object that is within his 4 Amos. And the Gemara has shown that Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish disagree whether one acquires an object that is within his 4 Amos. The Gemara now explains why Rabbi Yochanan, who maintains that 4 Amos does not affect acquisition, made a point of teaching that in the context of gifts, whereas Rish Lakish is maintaining that 4 Amos does affect an acquisition, and he made the point for teaching this in the case of lost articles. So the sugya continues about this specific novelty. So it says there's a specific novelty in Rabbi Yochanan's mention that 4 Amos cannot acquire a gift, and a specific novelty in Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's mentioning that it can acquire a lost article. So that's a really deep subtlety and a deep insight. The Gemara is going to explain. The novelty of Rish Lakish's stating specifically that a lost article can be acquired through 4 Amos is as follows. If even regarding a lost article which one does not acquire through another's intent to transfer ownership to him, the law is that one acquires it by means of being within his 4 Amos, and then regarding a gift which one acquires through another's intent to transfer ownership to him, it is not certain that he acquires it by means of being within 4 Amos. So let me explain it. Since the ruling that 4 Amos can affect an acquisition is more obvious in regard to a gift than in regard to a lost article, Rish Lakish is making the point of stating that it affects an acquisition of a lost article, thus seizing upon this novelty. And it goes without saying that the 4 Amos can affect an acquisition of a gift. So the Gemara is going to continue and explain the novelty of Rabbi Yochanan. So the novelty in Rabbi Yochanan stating specifically that a gift cannot acquire through 4 Amos is as follows. If even regarding a gift which one acquires through another's intent to transfer ownership to him, the law is that one does not acquire it by means of being within 4 Amos. Then regarding a lost article, says the Sugya, which does not acquire through another's intent to transfer ownership to him, is it not certain that one does not acquire it by means of being within the 4 Amos? So in other words, since the ruling that the 4 Amos cannot affect acquisition is more obvious in regards to an ownerless object than in regards to a gift. So Rabbi Yochanan is making a point of stating that it does not affect an acquisition of a gift. So seizing upon this novelty, it goes without saying that the 4 Amos acquisition cannot affect an acquisition of an ownerless object. So it's amazing because they're really explaining different parts of the same law, and they're explaining it in a way where they're both compatible. They're just discussing different parts of the same thing, which is really just a smart and deep insight. So Rabbi Yasa taught in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the 4 Amos method of acquisition is only with respect to a get. It does not do so with respect to gifts and other acquisitions. So the Gemara is going to question this ruling. So it looks like there's a novelty that's being put out there that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is saying that this is something that the 4 Amos is talking about, a lost article. And so that when you're coming along a lost article, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, that 4 Amos will acquire it for that type of property, the lost article. But Rabbi Yochanan is effectively saying that the 4 Amos cannot acquire a gift. So those are two different things, and the novelty is teaching about two different types of property that could be acquired. So Rabbi Zera, this Gemara is going to question this ruling, and the Sugya reads that Rabbi Zera raised the following challenge before Rabbi Yasa, why we learned in the same Mishnah, and the same is true with respect to Kiddushin. So the question is, well, how can Rabbi Yochanan rule that this is a method of acquisition applying to Gitten when we know in the Mishnah it says that this is also within Kiddushin? How can it be? So Rabbi Yasa is going to deflect the challenge, and Rabbi Yasa says in the Sugya that Rabbi Yochanan's ruling that the 4 Amos method is exclusive to Gitten is not meant to exclude Kiddushin. Rather, it is self-understood that perhaps also to Kiddushin, for as it is for Gitten, as it is with Kiddushin. In other words, he's using a scriptural analogy for the Hekesh, that he's using a Hekesh between Gitten and Kiddushin, based on the verse of Devarim 24:2, chapter 24, verse 2, and that he's equating their laws. He's equating the laws between Gitten and Kiddushin, so that Rabbi Yochanan is stating that the 4 Amos method is exclusive to Gitten, and it is if it's connected to Gitten and Kiddushin together. In other words, that effectively what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that they're both connected. So Rabbi Zera is going to challenge Rabbi Yochanan's teaching from the same Mishnah, and it says, but we learned in the very same Mishnah, and the same is true with respect to a debt. So if you remember about this, there's always a question about with a debt. If a creditor comes along and says, throw me the money you owe, and he threw it to him, but it was lost before he reached his hand, then what's the law? And in this case, if the money landed close to the lender within his 4 amos, the borrower is no longer liable for the debt. So the Mishnah clearly states that the 4 amos method applies to debts. So how can Rabbi Yochanan rule that this applies only to a divorce? And Rabbi Yasa is going to deflect that challenge as well about the debt. The Sugya says, Rabbi Yasa said to him, the case of a debt is different, for if the lender says to the borrower, throw the money into the sea, and the debt will be forgiven to you, and the borrower does as instructed, the debt is forgiven. So, even though the lender never got the payment, the debt is waived. So the Mishnah is referring to a case where the lender said to the borrower, throw my debt to me and you'll be free from any further liability. And the reason the borrower is exempted when the money lands close to the lender is not because the lender acquired the money through his 4 amos, but simply because the borrower carried out his instructions according to Rabbi Yasa. It's a very, very deep insight. So the Gemara is going to challenge that again. It says, but accordingly, if the lender explicitly freed the borrower of liability upon throwing it, then even if the money landed close to the borrower should gain an exemption. Thus, we learned in the Mishnah, if the money landed close to the borrower is still liable for the debt. So the Gemara is going to answer this, and then we're going to finish it up. So the precise case of the Mishnah is where the lender said to him, throw my debt until it enters my domain, upon which you'll be free from further liability. That's what the Mishnah is saying. And since when it lands close to the borrower, it is yet to enter the lender's domain, so the borrower is still liable. And the Gemara is going to relate and say that Rabbi Abahu related all these challenges that Rabbi Zera raised before Rabbi Yasa with respect to the ruling he cited in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and that this was raised by Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish before Rabbi Yochanan himself as challenges against Rabbi Yochanan's ruling, and Rabbi Yochanan resolved them with these very same resolutions offered by Rabbi Yasa. So that's amazing. Let me just explain this by the Rosh Cirillo. So the Rosh Cirillo is relating that Rabbi Yochanan received these challenges favorably, and he recognized them as strong challenges and praised Rish Lakish for raising them. And the thing about it is, if the debt lands in the lender's domain within his 4 amos, the borrower is going to be exempt from the liability, as the lender explicitly stipulated this. And you can check in the Rambam in Hilchos Malva Ve'lova, chapter 16, Halacha 1, and also in the Chosin Mishpat in Seif 120. It's the first one there, that this explanation, is dealing with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan according to this 4 amos method, which does not affect an acquisition, but it's like the Gemara is considered one's 4 amos like his domain, but really what's happening is that he was listening to the instructions of the person, and that's what caused the debt to be waived. In other words, if you're following what the person says for the debt to be waived, that's what triggered it, not by going within the 4 amos. So that's a really deep way to split hairs and try to understand this in a deeper way. And again, it's very important to cover, well, what is proper acquisition and what isn't, so that we understand it. And it matters because, every day, we're doing business, we're handling money, and we have to do it in a kosher way. You can't mislead people. You can't play games with it. You can't steal people's minds. You have to. The Torah expects you to always have fair weights and measures, and to do it in the right way. And you never lose by doing it the right way. Have a great day.